and out of focus. Here's your host, Sam Zervitz.
Thank you, Tally Olson, and this is In and Out of Focus, and today we're going to focus on a subject that I think all of us have dreams and aspirations about, and a lot of us give up on, perhaps too early, perhaps too late. But the subject is creativity. Creativity leading to art, leading to brilliance, leading to making a living at something that's a dream early on that we unfortunately don't follow up on because pressures in a society that's mostly job-oriented take us away from loving music, loving painting, loving sculpture, loving writing, wanting to do these things and thinking, are we good enough? Could we have made a living at it? And we spend possibly a portion of our days thinking, did I give up on it too early? Anyway, are you creative? Do you have a creative gene that somehow goes unfulfilled because, unfortunately, you've been told you have to get a job? Even in education, we're stuck, unfortunately, with a system where in a job market you're told if those courses don't lead to a job, what do you need them for? What do you need humanities for? What do you need something about beauty for? What do you need something where you want to create for? Your chances of getting a job in a creative field are unfortunately limited, so you give up on that. What is it? What's the fascination with it? Who is creative among us? And I think about this, and when I think about this, there's a little known but beautifully done simplistic ballad by Harry Chapin, and this came out in the 60s. And when everybody was creative because people were dropping out. And in dropping out, they sat there and they wrote poetry and they sang folk songs and they had their revolution and things changed and the kids were in another realm. But Harry Chapin's song was Mr. Tanner. Mr. Tanner. And Mr. Tanner had a business. But the line in the song, the few lines in the song that really stayed with me, that I never forgot, and this is so true for so many of us. Music was his life. It was not his livelihood. It made him feel so happy and it made him feel so good. And he sang from his heart and he sang from his soul. And he did not know how well he sang. It just made him whole. Thoughtful. And I had an uncle who wanted to be a musician, but unfortunately had a children's clothing store and a living to make. And I had another uncle, and I want to talk about him a little bit because this other uncle hung on. His name was Aaron Sofer. He was one of 13 children, and he was my mother's brother. And he was born to paint, to sketch. He was a sketch artist, a quick sketch artist. He had a brilliant touch with pen and ink, and while he did washes, and he did thousands and thousands of these washes walking around Baltimore, and these pen and ink sketches walking around Baltimore. And for years, according to family legend, the 12 brothers and sisters, or the 11, whatever they were, the number were at the time, would say, Aaron, get a job. Aaron, you're wasting your time. And Aaron finally, toward midpoint in his life, was recognized. He was doing New Yorker cartoons. He did something called the Grammar Trial out of Washington when they couldn't get photographers in the courtroom. Everybody wanted one of Aaron's drawings. Aaron paid his bills to doctors and dentists with drawings. And Aaron suddenly became prolific, recognized, patron of the arts. Family, the Coen sisters, bought 2,000 of his paintings. 6 books were written about Aaron. In the early days of television, there was an Aaron television program where his pictures floated across your TV screen with appropriate music. And he made it as an artist, but he spent the better part of his life taking the slings and arrows of people who didn't believe you could make it as an artist in this society. Unfortunately, we live in a time and place where vocational programs, where job training programs, where other programs pretty well replace the arts in terms of our learning experiences, which leads me also to something my wife, who is a trained concert singer, with a magnificent voice, a God's gift voice, says you can't do art. You can't do anything without training. And I take exception to that because Aaron went to the Maryland Institute in Baltimore, the Art Institute, but he was, according to Family Stories, was thrown out for drawing the students instead of the models, among other things. I did write an article about Aaron later for an art magazine. He passed away in the 1970s. I hardly knew him. He kept to himself mostly. The family had pretty well discarded him, and when he became famous, the family tried to reattract themselves to him, and I don't know whether he was necessarily inclined to go with that. But Aaron, I wrote an article, and the article was what I knew about him and what I'd heard about him and how a famous artist became a famous artist. And I put something in that article as a curiosity because I asked, once we visited his studio, it was on University Parkway in Baltimore, and he always gave family members gifts, and this was a wedding gift. And he gave us a sketch of a beach scene. And I noticed in that studio his watercolors, he did washes, his watercolors were largely marked red, green, blue, yellow, and so forth. And I asked my mother later, how come Aaron has the colors marked? And she said because he was colorblind. And then she was a little angry that I put it in an article because she thought in some way it might hurt his sales. It never did. I mean, he couldn't paint quickly enough to sell the demand was phenomenal for what thousands and thousands of his pictures float around the area. Everybody knows who he is now, and he's been gone for years. Anyway, great movie line. Terrific movie line. I was channel surfing the other day, and there's this story. It's a little gem of a movie. It didn't get a lot of attention, I guess, but it's a cute movie where it's an ethnic movie where the kid in the movie is married and with a family with a lot of pressure. He wants to be an actor. And he would love to be an actor, and he's hanging on to this dream while the wife is yelling, you have to get a job, you have to support the family. So the kid goes to his spiritual leader and explains, wouldn't God want me to be happy? And the bearded, wizened spiritual leader looks at him and says, it's not about God. You're talking about Thomas Jefferson and the Bill of Rights and the Constitution with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You're not talking about here God. God wants you to get a job. God wants you to take care of your family, which is pretty much the bottom line in today's world. God wants, we want, you need a job. Forget it if you think you're going to be a writer. Forget it if you think. And even I think the John Grisham story was the great novel, with 30 novels or 40, whatever number of novels he's written. I think his first novel, A Time to Die, was rejected maybe over 100 times. And another story about a writer who was a salesman, the one who wrote the Dirk Pitt novels, and now he's written dozens and dozens of novels. And we actually saw him in a bookstore, Clive Cussler. And I introduced myself to him, and he griped about the movie industry doing things to his Dirk Pitt novels, Dirk Pitt being the underwater James Bond of the time. And this Clive Cussler is a terrific writer. So he's writing pop culture fiction, and he was griping about that. And he was an interesting character because the story is the way he got started. He wrote a book, Raise the Titanic, which was a huge bestseller, and there may have been a movie made about it. And he wrote this book, and he didn't get it published right away. So according to the story, as I read it somewhere, he sent the book to another agent and represented himself as an agent and said, can you sell it? Because I'd like to sell it as a movie, and if you'll represent it. So the other agent sold it thinking he was doing a favor to a fellow agent. And then after 5 or 6 bestsellers, finally, I think Cussler came clean and admitted that he was representing himself as an agent to another agent rather than a novelist directly to an agent. And that's the way he got started. You got to do a lot of stuff to get your material out there. I write, I paint, and I go nowhere. And I think I'm pretty good. Anyway, there's something else going on here that's kind of interesting that I followed over the years, and you may remember this. You used to see in very prominent full-page written ads, you used to see, they were usually in pretty well recognized magazines where the ad would say, "You too can be an artist," or "You too can be a writer. Take our test." So you would take an artist test where they would have you draw a picture of a duck and send it to them, and they would write back and say, "Send us $400 and we'll make you an artist." And you passed the duck test. Or the writing test where you would write a little short story and get the same response back. I imagine everybody got that response back. And the other thing I remember about this was it was kind of off the charts because I saw a parody of it once. There was for years this very solemn, monotone, soft, kind of pliable, very friendly artist who did in a half an hour program, and they did a series of these programs. He would show you how to paint. And I remember my parents took a cruise once where they had an artist on board, and it was a by the numbers where he said, if you do this, you do this, you do this, and 30 people would do this and come out with almost an identical picture. So this guy on TV is saying things like, doesn't that look nice? We'll mix a little orange and some pretty light blue here. And look, a mountain. And let's try some pink and yellow here at the top with a little bit of brown. And look, a tree. And then Saturday Night Live did a great bit on this a while back because the guy was almost comatose. He was doing this in a dream state. And here's a little white, and we'll put it in a corner with some purple. And look, a cloud. And they did a routine where they inserted between the lines, the guy is doing this, and then he's griping about his wife. And he's doing this, my wife, damn woman. And now let's put a little paint here with a little green and a little yellow. That woman will come in. And he was doing, and it was a hysterical bit. I never forgot that. What about, and this is kind of important in our creative venue, what about, and we're comparing the 60s to our time. It's comparable. There's a revolution going on. There are changes in the wind. A lot of things are happening. But the thing that's missing, that's evidently missing, and you can't avoid it. In the 60s, the time was defined by the folk singers, by the Harry Chapins, the Pete Seegers, the Leonard Cohens, the Peter, Paul and Marys, the Joan Baez, the Bob Dylans, the Simon and Garfunkels. They defined that time. That music was the history of the time. We don't have any of that now. Nobody's singing about 2016. Nobody's singing about Donald Trump. Nobody's singing about Cruz. Nobody's singing about any of these people, about Hillary or about Sanders. Nobody's singing about these people. Nobody's singing about elections, the Middle East, wars, race, getting together. We missed it. And I'm looking for songs that are going to tell me in 20, 30 years. Very interesting point about that, because music, and I'll talk a little bit about music. Music is the memory key. And people who think about music hear a song, remember a time. Even in our time, I remember the music so clearly. And it had a purpose, and it took us back. But we don't have that now. So, and there was David Halberstam. David Halberstam is a name I'll never forget. David Halberstam wrote maybe a dozen books before he passed away, sadly in a car accident, leaving a journalism convention in California. He was in a car accident and passed away fairly recently. Wonderful writer. He did something on Vietnam. He did something on politicos. He did something on the 60s. He wrote these beautiful books that captured in 400, 500, 600 pages, and you read it as if you were there. He got it. He got what was going on, all the nuances of our history floating by. He freeze-framed it for us, and he did us a real service. So anyway, there's a little David Halberstam blog that I picked up somewhere, and I've used it in classes, where David Halberstam is driving through Mississippi as a young journalist in the 60s. And he's looking in his car window because journalists in the 60s in Mississippi are not well received. And he thinks he's out somewhere all alone on a pitch dark road. And he's looking in his rearview mirror, and he thinks, if a truck shows up, it's got to be the Klan, it's got to be those people. Because, again, they were killing people. they were killing anybody who was a threat to their way of life, and certainly journalists were as much a threat as anybody. So Halberstam turns on his car radio, and he gets Simon and Garfunkel. And he says, in remembering this, he says they weren't political, but they caught the moment. And it was Garfunkel's perfect pitch, and it was the poetry of Paul Simon caught the moment. And whenever in future years, he ever heard Simon and Garfunkel, he was back on that dark road in Mississippi, looking in his rearview mirror, to see if he were being followed. And what do you remember about the singers that evolved out of your younger years? I see Wayne Newton as a child. I don't see Wayne Newton as a grizzled Las Vegas veteran. I see him as a child. And I see Wayne Newton as a child when I get a Bonanza rerun. And there's Wayne Newton, 12 years old, on Bonanza with that wonderful angelic voice. And he's got, in the Bonanza series, he's got a miserable father who doesn't want him singing because he wants him working on the farm, which is symptomatic of a lot of what's going on now. I don't want you singing. I don't want you painting. I want you working. You're not going to make any money off that singing. Anyway, and Wayne Newton is always singing Scarlet Ribbon for her hair. And the father is railing at him, and Ben Cartwright finally saves him by going to the father and saying he has to sing. The pastor wants him to sing in church this Easter. You can't turn him down for that. So Wayne Newton gets to sing. And Ben Cartwright saves the day again. But that's this Wayne Newton, this sweet little kid. It's not the sweet little kid anymore. You spend your life in Las Vegas, you're not going to be a sweet little kid, I guess. Anyway, here's a term that genuinely bothers me about art. It's always bothered me about art because I like to paint. I'm called an interpretive landscape painter, which means you can't tell quite what I'm painting. My wife turns it upside down. My wife turns it this way, that way. It looks like a landscape. And I'm slapping paint on a canvas, and I'm having a good time, and I'm planning on shows, and I want to get in a gallery. And, I like this. It relaxes me. Anyway, so at one point, years back, there was a community center show, and I took some canvases over and said, can I get in it? And they said, no, you can't, unless you were juried, you can't get in it. And I said, what's juried? And the lady in charge, I guess she's a curator type, said, juried? Juried means somebody judged you. And I said, where do I get judged? And who judges the judges? And then immediately I saw Leonardo with a piece of art. He's lugging along called Mona Lisa, and some guy at the gallery gate says, were you juried? And so then Picasso's got one of these things with a woman with 6 heads and 4 arms, all green, blue, yellow, and orange. And some guy says, were you juried? You need to be approved of before you can do art. I don't know where these juried people came from or what this is, and what's a juried piece of art. So anyway, is it like you have to pass a driving test to paint, an artistic driving test to paint? And if you're a painter, you're blocked at the gate. So, and then I remember a story. There was a great story about Chagall signing autographs, and this kind of transitions into the more mercenary part of the art community. And he's signing autographs at a dinner, and Madame Chagall looks at this, and he signed dozens of autographs, and she says, "Wait a minute! He's signing them on napkins. He's signing them here. He's signing them on pieces of paper." And she puts a stop to it and says, "It'll cost you $1 a piece from now on," because all of a sudden. His name on a piece of paper, of course, is worth something. As Chagall is worth something. But what is art? And what is really art? In your estimation, what constitutes art? We're living in a pop culture community at this point. And pop culture is art? Pop culture is not art. Pop culture is somebody who's singing out of a sound booth or slapping paint on a canvas. I don't know. I don't know what pop culture is. But all of a sudden, can a car be art? And I read somewhere the only car in the Smithsonian is an E-Type Jag. It's considered art. Is a dishwasher art? Is a washing machine art? Is a computer art? Look at an apple, and they look at the shape of the apple, and they say, wow, that's dazzling. You look at it. We saw a Tesla in a parking lot the other day. It's gorgeous. Is that art? Has somebody sculpted a car now? And then you've got the art of the deal. Here's the worst of it in terms of art. You've got Donald Trump, the art of the deal. Is Donald Trump an artist? The last thing in the world you think Donald Trump was is an artist. But he's got the art of the deal. Deal is an art form. And you've got doctors, and I've used retired physicians as classroom guests, where they will ask the class, is medicine art, business, or science? The treatment of patients, healthcare, is that art, business, or science? And largely, it comes down to everything now is science. It is rather business. Science too, but business also. Mostly business. How do you make a buck out of it? And this particular doctor that I used a half a dozen times in my classes at Towson made it very clear. Doctors aren't rich. Doctors make investments. That's how they make their money. And at the time, he said, with medical insurance, doctors don't make any money until May because all of their money goes into medical malpractice insurance. And he was mostly lamenting the fact that doctors are misseen and misperceived as being wealthy when they aren't. And I remember, what's art? What was art? Art got very bizarre in the 60s and 70s with Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol was a memorable character, and his stuff is worth millions on auction now. I don't know if I'd pay $4 million for a picture of a can. It doesn't do anything for me but a huge canvas of a can, an Andy Warhol canvas. And you see it every once in a while at an art auction. It's going for $4 million or something. And I remember we used to go to Andy Warhol movies. I don't know if anybody ever. Andy Warhol made movies. And we went to one of these movies, and these movies were really, really weird. I mean, as weird as could be, where the camera would freeze on somebody breathing up and down, and all you'd see is the stomach rising and the stomach falling for maybe an hour. Nothing happened. Or the camera would freeze on the side of a building, and for an hour or two you'd see nothing but the side of the building waiting for something to happen. But the oddest one in all of these, and there was actually a 7-hour Andy Warhol movie, and we got in about 3 hours late, and they said, you haven't missed anything. So there was this 7-hour Andy Warhol movie where he's got 4 faces in 4 blocks, and he keeps switching faces. And one of the faces talks. And the guy says, and this kind of stuck with me. The guy says, I'm the Pope. It's not an easy job. It's not a hard job. And every once in a while they'd come back to him and he'd say, I'm the Pope. It's not an easy job. It's not a hard job. And this was, actually it manifested itself in a lot of ways, and I never realized where this came from. But we had a crazy guy, was in something in Hopkins. It was a master's program called the Writing Seminars. And they had some characters in this class then. It was the last year of the instructor. The founder was Eliot Coleman, who was probably one of the great teachers and poets in American history, but he was going downhill. And he wasn't questioning anything at the time, where somebody would show up with a concrete poem. A concrete poem was the word poem in a plastic box on a card. And Eliot would say, who am I to say that's not a poem? And somebody else showed up with a huge board, and on the board were 10,000 L's going in the wrong direction and 1 L in the middle going in the right direction. And that was a poem, and Eliot wouldn't question it. But this was the kind of the bit in that class that went on. And Eliot, of course, was wonderful. Everybody loved Eliot. And I remember that class so clearly, too. I remember an incident in that class, and this was symptomatic of the theme of this program, too. A guy named Charlie, and he wasn't part of the program. So the novelist, Michael, comes running in yelling, somebody's got to read today. Cancel everything because this guy says he's got to read or he's going to jump out a window. And Michael Lynch, the novelist, says, can't question this, and I'm not going to take a chance. Let him read. So in comes a guy named Charlie. And Charlie is reading something out of something he's been writing called Make Me a Doctor, Make Me a Writer. And later, Charlie became a doctor who actually wrote a book about it, and the book got out. I saw it. Anyway, Charlie is reading, and he's reading to us about how his father is putting enormous pressure on him. Make me a doctor, make me a writer, and he wants to write desperately. And he reads. And then he leaves, and he doesn't jump out a window, and everybody breathes a collective sigh of relief at that point, which leads me to a movie. It was the Dead Poets Society, the wonderful Robin Williams little gem of a movie, where one of the kids in that movie wants desperately to be an actor. if you'll remember, and he gets a role in a Shakespeare play with a father absolutely fanatically pushing him toward medical school or toward anything but acting, anything but creative. The father is vicious and threatens him and pulls him out, and he gets in the Shakespeare. He sneaks himself into the Shakespeare play as the lead, does wonderfully well, is so proud of himself, and the father drags him home and rails at him unmercifully for disobeying and for acting, and the kid commits suicide. And then they blame Robin Williams, the teacher, for encouraging the acting because the school isn't going to take responsibility for that, and they were going to pin it on a very wealthy parent. And now about education, and I'm an educator. I'm a lifetime educator. It's part of me, and I deeply resent the fact that education is pushing toward, if it can't get you a job, it's not education. The only thing that's worth delving into as an educational experience is something that will lead you to a job. And I had two students, actually, more than two, but two that come to mind. When I was in a high school, my first teaching experience, I never forgot this. The guy's name was Charlie. Charlie sat in the back of the classroom and never opened his mouth. And Charlie was a very sweet child, and Charlie wrote beautifully. And he handed in papers, and they were beautifully written, and I never questioned it, that it wasn't the assignment. I loved Charlie. He was a good kid. So Charlie takes me upstairs to his locker, opens the locker door, and 10,000 pieces of paper fall out. And I say, Charlie, have you ever shown this to anybody? He says, no. You're the only one who's ever seen it. And that was very sad because Charlie never got a chance. There was another kid named David. And David drew. He was a brilliant artist. He would sit in the back of a mechanical drawing class, and dimensionally he would get the rows of students leading up to the front of the class, leading up to the teacher's desk, behind the teacher's desk, the clock. And he had a beautiful sense of perspective, and he drew an entire room this way, actively pursuing the art of mechanical drawing, which he hated. But it was the only thing close to art, and he was terrible at it, and he hated it, and he resented it, and the teacher resented him. And I went to the principal, Gene, and I said, Gene, can't you get this kid an art teacher? And Gene said, it's not in the budget, and send him to the School for the Arts. And, of course, he wasn't going to get in the School for the Arts anyway. So this kid, the last thing I heard was this kid never graduated and wound up with the wrong people and in prison. And the other thing, that was sad because how much talent is wasted because of the cookie-cutter approach to education, the assembly line, where everybody has to have X number of credits and X number of subjects, and you rarely, if ever, get a subject that's a carrot and a stick, where if you get the good subject, you'll take the math, which was the philosophy of our School for the Arts. And 98% of those kids go to college. A large number of them actually get into professions, creative professions. But the whole idea is, if they want to be in the play, they'll pass math. If they want to play in the band, or if they want to sing in the choir, they'll pass geometry. They'll pass physics, and it works. And I don't know why other schools don't use it as an approach to getting kids to do better. And then about relationships in the arts, and this is a kind of a multi-edged sword, if anything, because two creative people, trying to make it in the world on their own, as the artist and the writer, or the musician and the sculptor, rarely connect. And non-creative people with creative people rarely connect. I went to a school for a year in upstate New York. It was a mistake. I didn't belong there. I was too young. And I took a sculpture course. And it was a mistake, too, because I had no sense of geometry and no sense of dimension at the time. So I'm doing a bust of a head. And my roommate from Rockville Center, Long Island, who was a nasty kid anyway, I was just paired with him. He thought he was sophisticated, and I from Baltimore, below New Jersey, was a flunky. So he sneaks into the art studio at night, and he puts pimples on my face. He clays pimples on my face. So the next day, my sculpture, my bust of the head, the face is all broken out. And the instructor doesn't like this and thinks I'm doing it, and I get in all kinds of trouble with the instructor, and I think I got a D in sculpture for that. I couldn't, what could I say? My roommate put the pimples on my face. I never had a chance. I had as a friend, a dear, dear friend, and I met him through some people. His name was Eric. Eric was a pastry chef, trained in Berlin. And he liked to say he got out in 1939 on the last train out, compliments of the Gestapo. Eric was this brilliant pastry chef. His stuff looked like porcelain. He did 7-layer cakes that looked like porcelain. He did cakes for the governor. He did cakes for the White House. And Eric had a little bakery on York Road, in a shopping center on York Road where we'd stop in. And Eric would hold court. He was a consummate European gentleman, never married because after what he saw, he wasn't going to raise a family in that environment after he saw World War II and lived it. But he's since passed away. Eric was a wonderful man, very, very worldly, very, very regal, and he held these little kind of gatherings where he'd serve the coffee and the cake, and he'd have guests in from different places, and it was an experience. But Eric's talent was he could sculpt. He sculpted cakes, and they were they were absolutely magnificent. And he learned English. He learned writing, like Joseph Conrad. He learned writing by writing, and Eric wrote one of the really, really brilliant pieces of unpublished, and he would give me the manuscripts and ask me to critique them for him. And he wrote a magnificent manuscript once about a desert experience. He actually lived in Palestine, pre-Israel, in the 40s, and then came here later. So anyway, what about you? What about you? What about your expectations? What about your creative gifts? Do you have a need to be creative? Where does the inspiration go if you can't be creative? I write, I paint, I have no direction. I just do what I do. I'm a creative person. And I was fortunate, I like to write. I was fortunate. I landed in the school system where I wrote for people. I ghosted for a lot of people. And that got me, and at least I sat there at a typewriter and later at a computer and wrote. And I could make up things and I could write things. Now, what about instinctive versus taught? Two athletes come to mind as instinctive athletes. You couldn't teach what they did. You certainly couldn't teach George Herman Babe Ruth what he did. He came out of an industrial school in Baltimore, and he just played. He just played baseball, and nobody could tell him anything. He got into fights with Miller Huggins, his manager. He lived his life, but he was considered possibly the greatest American athlete of all time, at least the greatest baseball player. And what I remember growing up in Baltimore was, before he went to New York, we had Earl Monroe here, Earl the Pearl Monroe. And Earl the Pearl Monroe reinvented, whether anybody's going to give him credit for it or not, he reinvented basketball. Nobody, possibly Pete Maravich was along those lines too. But Monroe did things nobody ever did on the court. He was a will-o'-the-wisp. He just moved, and he moved instinctively. I don't think anybody could have coached an Earl Monroe. You were standing in one place. He was somewhere else. You'd look around. Where did he go? He had moves like nobody ever had. He changed direction on a dime. He did things with the ball. I mean, he was a magician. And he reinvented basketball. And then I remember in sports, and I like to talk, sports is an art. For some, it's an art. For many, it isn't. For many, it's just a paycheck. But there was a Spencer Tracy movie years back. Spencer Tracy was Newt Rockne at Notre Dame, first as a student and later as a potential research scientist. He got out of the lab and he said, "I'd like to coach the boys, and I want to teach the boys life's lessons." So they let him out of the lab. He meets with the head father, the head of Notre Dame, and he says, "What do I do?" They say, "I can be a great scientist. I like to be with the boys." And meanwhile, somewhere along the line, Gus DeRay, while Rockne was playing, in his playing days, Gus DeRay was the quarterback. And all they did then, this had to be around 1910, 1911, 1912, 13, somewhere in there, all they did was run. They ran, they were tackled, everybody piled on time, they got up and they ran again. And Gus DeRay was the quarterback. So Rockne says to Gus, and Notre Dame's a nothing at this point. Nobody ever heard of Notre Dame, little school in Indiana, in South Bend, Indiana. Anyway, so Rockne says to DeRay, let's go out on the beach and play around, and we'll throw the ball. And DeRay says, throw the ball? And Rockne says, throw the ball. So Rockne runs down the field, and DeRay throws him the ball. And all of a sudden, the forward pass is born. And then nobody expects Notre Dame to do anything. They're playing powerful Army, one of the best teams in the country. And DeRay throws the ball to Rockne, and he runs down the field with nobody anywhere near him. Then he throws the ball to Rockne again, and the Army guys on the sideline are looking at it saying, what is that? Never saw that before. And Notre Dame is born as a football power on that day against Army, at least according to the Spencer Tracy movie. And then they're throwing the ball, and it's a brave new world out there because the forward pass has been invented. And then again, I want to get back to something a little bit different. My brilliant wife insists, and I mentioned this, nothing in the arts happens unless you learn the basics first. And I counter this with, I worked with blind and vision impaired students for a while, and we had a blind child in our vision program. He had serious birth defects. The mother pretty well figured, she's got problems. This isn't going to be a very good situation until the child is about 2 or 3 years old, and he hears classical music being played. Whatever he hears Mozart, he hears Beethoven, he hears this, he hears that. He sits down in front of a piano at 2 or 3 years old, and he plays it precisely the way he heard it. He's got an ear, and all of a sudden, this kid is a prodigy. As a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old prodigy. And at that point, at early in life, he's playing with Stevie Wonder. He's playing at the White House. He's a blind child, and he's a musical prodigy. I think he went to Oberlin, and I lost track of it. But he was the pride and joy of the program. He went to the School for the Arts. But you didn't teach him. You didn't teach Aaron Sofer. There are people who you just didn't teach. They just have it. And what's the difference between the brilliance of somebody who's born with it and the brilliance of somebody who's taught it? And is genius a gift? Are you a genius? Is genius a curse? Einstein, of course, was a genius. He was the genius of all geniuses. So Einstein splits the atom, and Einstein's genius leads to the greatest curse mankind's ever known. Einstein writes Truman a letter, please do not use this bomb. Truman doesn't pay any attention to the letter, they use the bomb. And Einstein is not a happy camper at that point. Einstein is very saddened by the fact that his genius resulted in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and the only time any civilized country has ever used a weapon of that magnitude against another country. And then there was the wonderful little known, but I thought it was a beautiful little movie where John Travolta, is a nondescript character in a small town, and one day he's walking back from the bar, and all of a sudden there's a blinding light in the sky, maybe a meteor, maybe a flying star, whatever it is, but he's struck down. He's unconscious. He wakes up in the hospital, and all of a sudden, Travolta has this enormous fund of knowledge and this urge to learn more. He's mastering foreign languages in a matter of minutes. He's growing his garden with innovative crop discoveries that are making vegetables and fruits and this and that huge. He's doing all kind, and he knows stuff. He's reading a book in a minute. He's reading 10 books an hour. He's reading everything. He's devouring knowledge, and the people in the town are becoming very suspicious of him. And he's just become almost otherworldly. And finally, it's brain damage that's done it, which is going to lead me to another point about handicapped and autistic and that. But anyway, so Travolta is an instant genius, and by the end, of course, he's trying to get into certain people to share his gifts because he's a naturally sharing person and a generous person. And finally, of course, the government gets a hold of him, and they won't let him go because they're afraid of him. It's explained they don't understand him. And when they don't understand you and they're afraid of you, they don't want you running loose. And then finally, because his brain is so unique, he's dying from the neurological disorder caused by this. Something happened to his brain. He's approached by a world-renowned neurologist surgeon who wants to remove his brain, even though he's going to die shortly, remove the brain before death so they can study it, if he'll agree to that. And his friends, of course, very sympathetic to his situation, argue back, you can't have him. Let him die comfortably with his friends. Don't kill him. Don't do that. And they smuggle him out of the hospital and they save him, and with the army chasing him down and all these special people, these government types chasing him down, he dies in the comfort of his loved ones. Wonderful thing. Now I'm thinking about something else here. Go back to the beginning. We're talking about instinctive. We're talking about learned. And you've got Grog, the cave dweller, Grog. And you can imagine Grog's wife yelling, get out there and kill us a saber-toothed tiger and protect us, or get out there and kill some animal so we can have dinner. Grog is painting on the cave wall. And some of these paintings are pretty sophisticated as we see them now. So where did Grog learn? Who taught Grog to paint on a cave wall? And you can imagine that woman, that poor woman, spinning her wheels saying, Grog, that crazy Grog, he's painting on the cave wall again. And then I'm thinking the pyramids, Stonehenge, the architecture of the ancients, the Phoenix, artifacts, art, religious artifacts. Are these art? And if they are art, it's going to lead us to another avenue of exploration, and that is, of course, those in the Middle East destroying the art, the thousands of year-old artistic creations done in the name of religion, and most of the art, of course, in the Renaissance was done in the name of religion anyway, which is kind of... Now, what about advertising in art? And there was a woman in the 70s and 80s that I like to think about. Her name is I don't know, I haven't heard about her for years, Lois Rice, who was a print advertising person and was at the top of her field, coming out of the Midwest, I think, and had an agency and was doing things with art and advertising in print that were absolutely spellbinding. And this would be appropriate now. In the 1980s, she's doing an anti-nuke campaign, and she's running drawings, and they're her drawings of environments and urban areas being blown away, being decimated. And what you see in the middle of the street is a doll ripped to shreds. And the tagline, I don't know if she wrote her own taglines, but the tagline under it is, if the condition of the bomb or the weapon or whatever you want to call it did this to the doll, what do you think it did to the people? And it was wonderful stuff, really wonderful stuff. And then I remember Lois Rice, and I remember a teacher. I remember another teacher. I remember Elliot Coleman from the writing seminars. But I had another teacher. His name was Ralph Harper. He was a minister from Moncton, Maryland. He considered himself one of the foremost existential thinkers in this country, and I took 3 courses from him because I loved the guy. He was crazy as a bedbug, but I loved the guy. Wonderful teacher, mesmerizing teacher because he was a minister. I mean, when he spoke, you listened. And I took a poetry course from him. And I took another course from him because this was kind of, I guess, what I got out of this. The poetry course, he actually sent me downtown to meet the Barragans. And I didn't meet the Barragans, but I met others. And the Barragans were poets. The Barragans were part of the anti-war group, led they were anti-war people. I met them, but he did another course called Thriller and Novel and Film that was a wonderful course where he determined, and Harper was an artist. Harper was a brilliant writer, and what Harper wanted from you was basically to take what he gave you and to take what you thought and to make something different out of it. 2 and 2 equals something that was never thought of before. He wanted a merging and an originality. He didn't want you to repeat back what he taught. So anyway, I remember this. He showed his thriller novel and film. He was doing detective, Western, science fiction. And he showed a film for each one. And for science fiction, he showed Fantastic Voyage, the Raquel Welch movie where they reduced everybody to microbe size and pumped them through the body to save the patient, where they could get into the body and actually from the inside and work on the patient. So I'm looking at this, and I asked Harper, and I should never have done this. I asked Harper, "Is Raquel Welch science fiction?" And he looks at me and he says, "Yes." and you are too. And I just kind of sunk into the chair and never said anything to him again because he scared the heck out of you. But he was a great teacher, wonderful teacher. And then I want to talk about, winding down a little bit, I want to talk about special needs kids, handicapping conditions, dyslexia, dysgraphia, autism, and genius. And there's something, I've got a book I thumbed through where there's a picture, a drawing by an autistic artist with one of these memories where he can draw, he can see it, and he can replicate it almost like a photograph. He can take a picture, he can look at Paris, and he can draw everything he sees, every brick, every person, every little bit, and a dyslexia. And I'm wondering if when we quantify in education, when we quantify handicapped children, special needs children, do we look at their gifts? And even when we were working with special needs children, we had a tag that not handicapped, handicapable, because there's a lot of genius in the limitations, the handicapping conditions, and teachers are looking at how can I make up for it so I can teach them what I'm teaching them by giving them accommodations, or do I credit their gifts and teach them above and beyond because they're capable not only barely of learning what I'm teaching, but they're capable of much more than that. And should teachers be prepared for this, for emotionally, intellectually, and physically impaired to be equipped to recognize more artistic students? And that I think is a logical question. And you've got adults, in a lot of instances, who are, I actually worked with a genius. I did a little bit of newspaper work years and years ago, and the mother calls, and she says, my son is a genius. He tests out, his IQ tests out off the charts, and nobody will go near him, nobody will hire him, nobody understands him. And what she was saying was, genius is as much limiting as impairment, as retardation, as intellectual impairment. And so the kid comes in, and I'm giving him writing assignments, and he's writing these stories where nobody can understand the language, and he's doing things with these stories that sound like Kafka, like Kafka with his Metamorphosis, with I woke up one morning and discovered, the bug or whatever. Anyway, so this kid, his name was Peter, and he was a sweet child. He was a nice kid, and I kept giving him writing assignments, and nobody could understand him, and the publisher's coming in yelling, what's this? And I kept him around, and he got paid for his articles. And then he comes in one day, and he runs into the publisher, who's wanted him going for months. And I ignored the publisher and kept him around and kept giving him writing and putting it in the publication. So the publisher comes in, and Peter says, I met with them, and they used a tautology. And the publisher doesn't know what a tautology is and says, that's it, he goes. I won't have that language around here, which is a prime example of fear of genius in our world. We're scared of bright people. Bright people are nervous. We want average. We don't want bright. And there was a uniformly bright guy, one of the brightest guys I ever met in the school system. And he had a vocabulary to beat all. He used to write me memos and say, continue your exeges. And I had no idea what an exege was, but I continued it because I figured if this guy liked it, it must be all right. But nobody knew what to make of him. They swore he lived by his thesaurus. So one day he's at a meeting, and everybody's grumbling. It's an administrative meeting, and nobody likes what's going on. And they're agreeing, they're disagreeing, they're having their outs with each other. And he stands up and he says, I believe you're all a group of sycophants. And somebody says, he called us a sycophant. That's good, isn't it? that was part of somebody who's super bright and how they are reacted to by others. Anyway, I remember I went to this place for a little while I mentioned called Bard College in upstate New York, and it was full of writers, actors, artists, poets, sculptors. It was all kinds of, everybody there had a persona. There was a guy there who claimed he was a troll. He was born under a bridge in Urbana, Illinois. There was another guy there who had a party for Mau Mau. Mau Mau was one of the first great drug dealers out of the village, and the FBI was coming for him, so they had a going-away party. This guy shot the proctor with a spear gun when he tried to come in. They were crazy. A lot of them were crazy. And the craziest of all was there was an art studio there, and there was a guy who looked like Moses in a wheelchair who would roll in and out of the art studio. He was an art major, and he was a good painter. So we had an arsonist there. And the arsonist had his fires for about 6 or 8 weeks. The arsonist had a fire every week. Friday night, you got a date for the fire. Because it was scheduled. So one day this guy comes rolling out on his wheelchair, comes rolling out, and he says, there's a fire in the studio, get my stuff out. So I go in the studio and I come back and I say, yeah, you got a fire. And I'm hauling out his canvases, I'm hauling out his paints and brushes and his easel and his stuff. And I said, but it's Thursday. It's a mistake. The fire's not scheduled till tomorrow. And then they had Pinkertons all over the place. And then one day, the guy who was the suspected arsonist went down the road to get a bottle of milk and something from the market, never came back, and the fire stopped. But that was the college. Now, a couple of other things here in wrapping up. Wagner and Hitler, interesting duo in history. Richard Wagner and Adolf Hitler. And Wagner died in the 1880s, and Hitler, of course, was prominent in the late 1920s into the 1930s and 40s. So, but according to Rosenberg, who was one of the ranking National Socialists in the late 20s and early 30s, Hitler never did anything without reading Wagner first. Wagner, the concert person, but Wagner, the writer. And Wagner was untrained. And Wagner was largely rejected by the Meyerbeers and the Mendelssohns and the rest of them in the arts community, largely Jewish. And Wagner had decided, he met with Bakunin, I think, the revolutionary, and decided he's going to go after the arts because Bakunin is doing it in politics. He can do it in the arts. He's going to have an art revolution. He was credited with having an art revolution. His stuff was vilified. His work was vilified during his lifetime, but his family kept it alive afterward by kind of reinventing him in Bayreuth, which was the headquarters of the family. And they have a Bayreuth festival every year. Who shows up at the Bayreuth festival? Neo-Nazis and skinheads, because they understood Wagner better than anybody. Wagner was a genocidist. Wagner was a terrible man. Wagner was a womanizer. Wagner was a drunk. Wagner looted treasuries. But after the fact, they still play Wagner. Wagner music played in the concentration camps, but they still play Wagner, and they still argue about whether Wagner was a genius because he made the revolution in music and he was self-taught. And I wound up writing some material for somebody who did a Wagner political biography for years, trying to take Wagner down and to challenge the status quo on Wagner. There's another thing that stuck with us. While we were growing up, while we were students, everybody was reading Thomas Mann and a little short story which defined us all of us as frustrated creative types. Tonio Kroger was a little Mann short story, kind of actually it was more like a novella, where Tonio is growing up in a European family with a burgher father, a business father, and a creative mother. And he's torn between the two, and which way is he going to go? And that was the story we were all reading. We were all torn between make a living, getting some kind of a job situation, or honor the arts and stay with the arts. My father was a businessman, and my mother was creative. My mother was in the arts. And I think my mother was dominant because my father kind of pretty well froze me out of his drugstore, claiming I had no business sense at all. And my mother was always talking about arts, always reading, always laughing, always creating. And my mother was the joy, and my father was sort of the business, the dull burger business type. And I took to her. So anyway, who's better? Who's smarter? Who's more gifted? Who's more talented? We are living in the politics of a population that unfortunately favors the business end of it, the art of the deal. I mean, if Trump came in there as a painter or a musician, do you think anybody would pay any attention to Trump? And didn't have any money, but was what was a legitimate artistic genius, creative genius? Nobody would pay any attention to him. And I remember at Hopkins, I didn't want to go to school, and my late wife said, "You have to take courses. Take Dr. Miller's art course. Everybody takes Dr. Miller's art course and gets an A." And what was that? And I said, "I won't get an A. I don't understand this stuff. I'm not Hopkins." And she said, "Take Dr. Miller's art course." Dr. Miller's art course was a dark room at Hopkins where what he would do is he would turn the lights out. You would see pictures of the Fras and the Fras work. He liked the Fras, Fra Angelica, Fra Filippo Lippi. He liked the Fras. and he would play, and you would either hear drum beats or some muted poetry in the background or music, and you would watch slides of the frogs, and that was his course. And you had to write a paper or something, but I got an A. Anyway, I didn't know anything, but the thing I remember about Dr. Miller's course, the procedure and the program aside was. There was a closet in that room. It was a huge room with 100 people sitting in that room watching the slides, listening to the sounds, sights and sounds. And there was a closet in that room, and apparently just before he turned the lights out, some people got caught in that closet. A guy and a girl got caught in that closet. And as the lights went back on, they ran out of the closet and ran out of the classroom. So during the entire hour, there were 2 people in that closet and 100 people remembered those 2 people stuck in that closet. They got trapped in there. And finally, let's see, wrapping up pretty well. All right, Trump. And I'll get in a little bit about Trump. He's unpleasant. He's crude. He's certainly the art of the deal. Come on. So we had in our class, we had our Trump in our class, only he was a much nicer kid, only he had a vile temper, and he cursed a lot. And he was our actor. He was the class actor. He wanted desperately to be an actor. He went to acting school in New York. And then, and the last time I saw him was maybe 30 years ago at a class reunion, and he never forgave me for something I did in one of the school plays. He was an actor, but he became a diplomat, and he spent most of his life out of the country in Africa and Israel being a diplomat, and came back, and he was sort of Rip Van Winkle. So he shows up at this reunion, and he says, "I forgive you." And I said, "You forgive me?" Because there was a senior play, and nobody wanted a part in it. And it was a 3.5-hour English comedy that our crazy English counselor, he was the class counselor, the class advisor, the English teacher, the English department head, whatever he was, he concocted She Stoops to Conquer by Oliver Goldsmith as our senior play. And nobody wanted, there were 12 boys in the senior class. 11 of them turned the lead down. The lead was, you had to be on stage 3.5 hours, and you had to learn a whole lot of lines and all the nuances. And with a week to go, he didn't have a lead. Where's Richard Hardcastle? So he comes up to me. I'm number 12. And a really nasty kid named Billy, who had a very, very vile sense of humor, says, "Sam will do it." So he comes up to me, and with a threat of not passing senior English, he lets me know I'll make a fine Richard Hardcastle, and hands me the script. And I'm looking at this and I have no idea what the play's about. So I memorized 3 lines. And our guy in our class was the actor. He was in it, and I destroyed the play. Every time I forgot a line, and they did have cue cards, but every time I forgot a line, I said the lines I knew. And bring back vanity and affectation to last them the whole year. I wonder why London will not keep its fools at home. In my time, the follies of the town crept slowly among us, but now they travel faster than a stagecoach. So I just kept saying that. And somebody would yell, "That's Act 1, we're in Act 3. And I destroyed his play. So this is why he came up to me. He, the actor who became the diplomat, came up to me, put his arm over my shoulder and said, "I forgive you." And he got me. I mean, after the play, he got me good. We had a cast party. And they were driving back at about 2 a.m. And this was it was on a street called Liberty Heights and Garrison. The school was in town, and it was on a street called Liberty Heights and Garrison. And I'm wearing a bridge. I'm wearing like a wig and breeches. And they throw me out of the car, and I've got white powder all over me. They powdered me. And I'm thrown out of the car wearing a wig and breeches, standing on the street at 2 a.m. with cars driving by honking at me. I don't know whether he realized that was probably one of the most embarrassing moments of my life. I remember so much about. I remember that English teacher. That English teacher destroyed me. He had something going. And I wrote. I had no technical writing skills at all. I didn't know anything about where to put a comma. I didn't know anything about building paragraphs. I didn't know anything about verb-subject agreement. I didn't know anything. But he had something he cared about desperately. He was obsessed with it. It was called passive voice. And this English teacher, and I wrote, and I couldn't get around him. I used to get C's and D's because I used passive voice, and he would red ink your paper to death because passive voice, passive voice, passive voice. So I thought, in spite of the fact that I was a technically terrible writer, I thought I'd get around him. So I hand in a paper and a scroll. I roll it up in 2 pieces of wood, and I hand him a scroll. I figure he's got to appreciate the creativity. I got a D for too many passive voices. Next, I hand him a paper. I remember it was a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. It was the Twain story, and I read the Classics Illustrated version. We all used those. And I wrote a book report, and I made the book report look like a book jacket, where I put the report on the inside folded cover, and drew a castle and somebody with a horse and a knight in armor riding around on the front of. He gave it a D. Nobody ever handed in a book report in a book cover form, and I thought I was really clever. I couldn't get around him. I tried Moby Dick too in one of those. It didn't work. Anyway, but that was pretty much it. And I remember Gordon Porterfield. I'll never forget Gordon Porterfield. And I don't know whatever happened to Gordon Porterfield, but he was an actor and a playwright. And somehow or other he had a job in a middle school teaching kids poise, articulation, communication, body language, control, presence. And it was more than acting, and he was wonderful with this. He took middle school kids who were off the charts, street kids, and he gave them a sense of presence. And then as his night job, don't give up your day job, as his night job, he wrote crazy plays. Theater of the Absurd was big then. And later I was reviewing his plays, and he had plays where the elves attacked the audience with folded newspapers, and he had all kinds of things going on, and I would try to write about this while being attacked. And this was him, but he had it. He understood. Theater was right. Theater was a good thing because it taught kids something they couldn't get anywhere else. And I had a wonderful supervisor who confessed to me later, how'd you do it, Laurelyn? I said, how'd you do that? How could you stay so calm? She was the PR director in a school system under attack. It was like being the PR director at the Alamo with the Mexicans coming in, with whoever he was coming in. Anyway, but I would say, I'd say, how'd you do it? And she'd say, acting. I took a theater course. I acted the part. And somehow or other, she kept her cool. She kept her calm. I never saw her in the year I worked with her. I never saw her lose it once. And she had terrible pressure, And remember some other things. I mean, look, do you have to be crazy to be a writer? Do you have to be crazy to be an artist? I mean, you have to cut your ear off to be an artist. Stanley Elkin was a crazy writer. And he wrote some really, really wild stuff. We had somebody read in our writing seminars named Warren Fine, wrote something called In the Animal Kingdom. And he wrote image. He didn't write narrative. He wrote image because in that book, in the 1700s, somebody went back into the wilderness. And as he went back in the wilderness, all the language dissipated. So he read us this. And I heard he had problems later, too. And then Hemingway, of course, killed himself, as anybody knows. And my writing experience was I spent 8 years in the basement writing. And my kids wanted to know where I was. And I just wanted to write. And then finally they dragged me out of the basement and I became father, daddy. It took a long time. And then I've been imitated as a writer. And I don't want to go into that because I've seen people use my stuff. And I remember Monument Men, to me, was a wonderful, wonderful movie, where Clooney, of course, was the head monument man. And at the end of the movie, to justify taking art experts back into battle to save the greatest art in the world from destruction, from the Russians, from the destruction, they lost 2 people. And in the inquiry at the end, somebody says, was it worth 2 lives? And Clooney says, was it worth saving a civilization? And there was a guy named Varian Fry, a little-known character, who was sent to Europe to save 100 geniuses from war. And I have a 6 degrees of separation connection with this. Varian Fry saved 2,000 people. He wasn't coming back. They closed him down, and he wouldn't come home because he saw there were a lot of artists, musicians, scientists, geniuses. And I had at Bard College, that crazy college in upstate New York, there was somebody named Heinrich Blücher who was saved by Varian Fry. who taught a philosophy course that everybody had to take. And Hyman Blucher was married to Hannah Arendt, who defined the experience with the Nazis as the banality of evil. And I had Heinrich Blucher for a lecture series, and I heard Hannah Arendt with Dwight MacDonald and Norman Potts in College Park in the 60s arguing about the German war machine, debating the German war machine, where Arendt said, we gave in, we caved, and if we had fought them and not turned over lists and not been so pliable, we could have saved 2 million people. While MacDonald and Potts insisted the German war machine was too precise, too well ordered, too much, too perfect in its way in terms of how it set itself up, and we couldn't have saved anybody. It was a wonderful lecture. So I'm thinking of Arian Fry, and I'm thinking of this lecture with Hannah Arendt that I heard, and I'm thinking of Heinrich Blucher, and it's kind of like my connection to saving the arts a little bit anyway, not directly. But what about art? What about the art of cooking, the art of teaching, the art of the deal, the art of healing? Is that art, actually? Or acting and being? Who are we really? Are we somebody else? Actors particularly have trouble coming back. And I think one of their problems is they get into character, and then they have to be themselves. If they never knew themselves in the first place, they've got really, really serious problems. And there was a cute bit where when Ronald Reagan became the president, Saturday Night Live did a cute bit where Reagan is complaining to one of his advisors. He doesn't like this role. He liked being governor better. He's got to do too many mean things being the president. Can't he just be the governor again? I remember Robin Williams on Politics. Robin Williams did a movie where he was the president. Robin Williams was an artist as an actor and an artist as a comic. And Robin Williams did a movie where he was the president, and he finally gave it up over a computer glitch that got him the win. Wonderful movie. And here's a question to take with you. Recognizing a great painter, a Manet, a Monet, a Chagall, a Picasso, my mother had a friend whose husband, Ferdinand, in Baltimore, a zillion years ago, was buying Picassos and buying French Impressionists before anybody knew what they were worth. He bought lots of them, and the story was, when my mother's friend passed away, she had an apartment full of Picassos. And then there was that little scene on the Titanic where Rose and her crazy fiancé, Cal, Billy Zane, you hated Billy Zane for that role. I don't see how he ever got another part after that, because he was always that Cal, slapping around his fiancé while, Jack Dawson was trying to get her away from him. Anyway, so Rose, is taking out pictures as they're setting up their stateroom in the Titanic, and she's got some French Impressionists. And Cal is railing about them and saying they'll never amount to anything. And that reminded me of my brother-in-law. He went to a college where, at the time in the 40s, my late brother-in-law, where in the 40s, where he was told Faulkner will never amount to a Bill of Beans because his stuff was a little strange too. And a great line, somebody in a museum with a friend. The friend says, how can you be so enthusiastic about something you can never afford? The friend says, I'd rather appreciate things I can't have than have things I can't appreciate, which is the essence of museums, I think. And on that note, I'm thinking of Mel Brooks. One of the last things I'll get to is Mel Brooks, his History of the World. And his Where Did Music Come From, if you remember, it was a hysterical little bit where somebody is dropping a rock on Sid Caesar's foot, and he screams out a note, ah! And another rock on his foot, and he screams out, ee! And another rock, and he screams out, ah! And they're dropping rocks on his feet, and he's singing. And they keep dropping the rocks, and there's the first music, and the first writing, the first sculpture, the first paintings, the first plays. And I like to think my people survived because we wrote everything down. And it became the Dead Sea Scrolls, of course. It makes sense. We're the first writers. I've said this. I've thought this all my life. Writing saved us. And I'll conclude this bit on creativity with a quick poem I wrote that I think covers it pretty well. Of course God delivered the words and images, or she did, after she bought me oil paints and passed on Where else does this come from? I'm an accidental teacher, an accidental artist, an accidental writer, an accidental poet. The dispensation is not of my doing. We lately revere a local surgeon who performs miracles on babies and always credits divine guidance for his successes. Genius is not always a generic trick. Every image and word I capture and preserve for posterity, every uninhibited thought, every gesture, expression, time, place, event, dialogue, confrontation, joy, tear, sense perceived, attack on my otherwise soulful flesh is a gift not of my choosing. I'm creatively better than others, not as good as most. A velvet monotone each morning. My prison, a maniacal clock, whispers, today is the day I must create again, but I am never told what my Creator wants from me. I am never given directions, how it can be shaded, presented for public consumption. I follow my celestial staircase to a quiet corner where the shelves and tabletops are empty or are filled with collectibles, where I struggle blankly or am overwhelmed with possibilities, where yesterday's miracles compete with today's emptiness. And above my skylight windows, I am in departure, directed by a luminous golden daughter, a seraph I barely knew, who now fills my creative emptiness with her chef's spirit. And that's pretty much it as far as I can go. And I'll leave you with one thought. How do you value art? Who puts a price tag on art? And does that defeat the purpose? Who says this is worth $1 million or $2 million or $500,000 or $25,000? There's a story, I guess, where the Forrest Gump writer didn't know what he had, and he somebody told me, he knocked out Forrest Gump in 2 weeks. Winston Groom wrote Forrest Gump in 2 weeks. And Hollywood got a hold of it, and he's looking at a blockbuster movie with Tom Hanks, and he didn't make any money. So he writes a nasty Forrest Gump sequel that they can't use under any circumstances. I read both of them. This Forrest Gump was despicable. And then why, in our wildest dreams, would Harper Lee, the late Harper Lee, she just passed away, write a sequel, years and years later, write a sequel to Kill a Mockingbird where she's got Atticus Finch as a Klansman? When we love Atticus Finch, he's one of the most endearing characters in American literature, and all of a sudden she's done a revised Atticus Finch who's despicable in his way, and at least he's certainly not what we thought Atticus Finch was in saving everybody and representing, whatever he represented in those days. Anyway, next week, all about high school reunions. The darkest side of high school reunions. Should you skip it? Why does anyone attend? Or as one wag once said, you go to prove you're not the asshole everybody thought you were. And I got the idea. I just finished John Grisham's book, Bleachers, which is, it's not his regular fare. It's about somebody who goes back to another time when he was a football player to honor a coach who's passing away, who was a pretty vicious character in his day, sort of a Bear Bryant type. Anyway, I'll see you next week. I look forward to talking to you. It's been a pleasure. And in and out of focus.
This has been a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production. Thank you, Sam Zervitz.